Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming in for this month's tech session webinar from PowerShell.org. My name is Nicholas Ketchell. I'm here with Mike Robbins. He works at Vital Care as a Senior Systems Administrator. He's also a Sapient MVP and a Microsoft MVP in Windows PowerShell. He's here to talk to us about writing advanced functions and the top 10 considerations when writing them. Mike?
Thank you. So, my name is Mike F. Robbins. Well, I go by Mike F. Robbins online, but it's Mike Robbins. Today I'll be presenting a session on the top 10 considerations when writing PowerShell advanced functions. And some of this has already been covered, but I'm also leader and co-founder of the Mississippi PowerShell User Group, co-author of Windows PowerShell TFM 4th edition, author of Chapter 6 in the PowerShell Deep Dives book, and winner of the advanced category in the 2013 scripting games. Let's talk about what we're going to cover in this session. So we're going to talk about readability. That's one of the most important things, because even if your code is PowerShell code when you're writing functions is not that great, as long as other people can follow it, that's a big plus. And it doesn't matter if you're the best person in the world at writing PowerShell code. If nobody else can read your code, then it's garbage. Naming is very important, and it's something that most of us who use PowerShell on a daily basis, we take that for granted, but there's a lot of people who don't understand the naming conventions. We'll talk about parameters, commandlet binding, parameter validation, verbose output, pipeline input, error handling, comment-based help, and support should process. And this certainly is not a deep dive into any one of these topics, because you could spend an entire session on any single topic here. So let's go ahead and get started with our demo, because we've got a lot of information to cover. I'm going to jump over to a VM. Okay, so just let me know if you can't see my VM. But what I'm showing here already is I've got 3 machines. I've got a Windows 8.1 workstation named PC01, which is what I'm performing the presentation on. I've got a domain controller named DC01, and that one's running server 2012 R2, so those two have, well, actually the PC has the latest build of PowerShell version 5, which is the production preview that came out a couple of days ago. And I have a SQL server named SQL03, and I'll jump over to that one real quick. I want to show you one thing on it. So SQL03 actually does not have PowerShell installed. It's a Windows 2008 non-R2 with no PowerShell whatsoever. I know that's pretty small, but we're not going to be on this machine very long. Okay, so let's talk about naming. So when it comes to naming, as I said, if you've been using PowerShell for a while, this is a given. But I recently worked with some people, and they had a specific reason for not using verb-noun. And I kind of want to cover that because after I talked to them, they understood the process a little bit more. So to find an approved verb, you simply use get verb, and we'll just run that real quick. We're not going to spend a lot of time on naming because it's very basic. So when you run get verb, and I've sorted it by the verb name, and I've piped this to out grid view. And since I'm running PowerShell version 5, I can actually use Control Plus to make what's in out grid view larger. But you want to find one of these verbs in here. And you can also see what group, like grant is generally associated with security here. So go through that list, find the verb. And you want to use a Pascal case name. So you don't want it all lowercase, but you don't, Pascal case is proper case, is what it boils down to. Also, you don't want to use camel case. And when you're writing your functions, you want them to look and feel like a real commandlet. So a lot of the things you can look at the default commandlets that ship with PowerShell and see how they're doing things. But you also want to keep your noun singular, just like the default commandlets. So if you wrote a function, a simple function, and it was to get the PowerShell version, chances are if you call it get version, then somebody else, either Microsoft or another company, is eventually going to write a commandlet that's called get-version. So you're going to have a naming collision. And that was the reason that the people that I recently worked with, they said, well, we're not going to use verb-noun because of naming collisions. And what I told them is prefix your nouns. So you could call it get PS version. But there's a pretty good chance that even get PS version, there's going to be a naming conflict at some point. So what I'll typically do, I'm sure you've probably worked with some other commandlets, maybe the Active Directory commandlets where it's get AD user or get AD computer, so it's got a prefix for the product. And since my initials are MR for Mike Robbins, I'll typically prefix my noun with Mr. So it's get Mr. PS version. And of course that's not foolproof, but it does help prevent naming conflicts. Well, these functions, I've actually just loaded these functions into memory, and I've called these as I've been talking about them. When you do that, what happens is the functions are loaded in the memory, and they exist in the function PS drive. So these are the three functions that I just loaded. And if you want to remove those functions from memory, short of closing your PowerShell session, you can simply just remove them from the function PS drive. And you'll see that they were removed. So now if I called one of these functions that are previously loaded into memory, it no longer exists. I'll provide this code, and I've got it heavily documented, so if somebody who didn't attend the webinar, if they read this, it'll be in context, but it's also to help me to remember what to say. Okay, so and if there's any questions, just go ahead and type them in. I'd prefer to cover them as we go. So let's talk a little bit about parameters. One of the problems with, especially with IT pros, is a lot of IT pros come from an environment where you're repeating yourself all day. Maybe you're creating Active Directory users. So you're pointing and clicking in the GUI all day long. And then you come to PowerShell, and even though it's more efficient, a lot of times what happens is you end up with 50,000 scripts because you're hard code values. And you'll have a script that maybe does the same thing and it's got different names or different properties in it, and you've hard-coded those properties. So you're kind of doing the same thing. You're repeating yourself in PowerShell instead of the GUI, and you're creating technical debt for yourself, because if something in all those scripts need to be changed, then you've got to go through and change all that in all the scripts. But if you make your commands, your functions more dynamic, then you have a smaller code base to have to maintain, and if there's changes down the road, you'll have less work to do, is what it boils down to. So if you wanted to parameterize, say, a computer name, then you put that computer name in a parameter block, and it's a param block. So when I call this test Mr. parameter function, then I can specify the computer names. And so why did I use computer name and not server name, or not computer, or not host, or so on? And I'll just create a simple function. Let's not worry about the complexities of this, because I'm kind of jumping ahead with this function. But I want to find out how many commandlets that exist on this machine, and it has the RSet tools installed, but how many commandlets have computer name, computer, server name, host, and machine for parameters? You can see there's 59 commandlets that have computer name. And this is one of those things with standardizing your functions so that they act and feel like the default built-in commandlets. Because someone who's familiar with PowerShell, they can pick up your commandlet and they know, hey, all these other commandlets use computer name for the parameter, and they're going to guess that's probably what the parameter is. So since there's 59 commandlets by default with a computer name parameter, that's what I chose. And also the casing, it uses a Pascal case parameter name, so I make it look just like the default commandlets. Okay, so now let's just jump back to our function that we had before. And it's still loaded into memory, but we'll just load it again. So you'll notice that all I have at this point is a computer name parameter. And there's a couple of different ways to see the parameters. I can look at the syntax. I can see here that, yes, there is only a computer name parameter. And there's another way to see the parameters. And I can see that, of course, again, there's only a computer name parameter. So commandlet binding is an attribute that you add that turns a function into an advanced function. So the only thing we've added at this point is commandlet binding, that one line. Now commandlet binding does require a parameter block. So if you don't have any parameters and you want to turn your function into an advanced function, then you can just have a blank parameter block without any parameters in it, but it is required if you want to use commandlet binding. Okay, so now we can see with IntelliSense here that we've got a lot of additional parameters that were added simply by defining commandlet binding. We run the same two commands again that we previously ran. You can see now we've got this thing called common parameters. And we run the other command and you can see that all those additional parameters are what's considered to be common parameters. This may differ depending on what version of PowerShell you have, like pipeline variable was added in PowerShell version 4, and information variable was added in PowerShell version 5. What I've also done, since it's not possible to cover everything in this 1 hour session, is I've added the help topics that I recommend reading to further your knowledge. And these help topics, one more thing about the help topics that I've added. I've actually commented these out, but if you can actually remove the comment, or you can just select help and you can actually run that and it'll pull it up. I commented them out because I didn't want to run them during this session. So parameter validation is something, it's probably one of the more important things when you're creating functions. You don't want your function to get halfway through and maybe even make some changes to a system when the input that was given is invalid and it can't possibly complete. You want to terminate the execution of your function as soon as possible when you know you don't have valid input. There's lots of different ways to do parameter validation, but the default built-in parameter validation attributes that exist in PowerShell, it's a standardized way, so I'm validating the same way that somebody else would be validating. I'm not writing my own custom code in my function that's going to be different than everybody else's. Now, what I'm initially going to show you here, this isn't officially a way to validate input, but I actually do consider it a way to validate input. What I've done is I've typed my computer name variable as a string. So what happens when I call that function with one value for the computer name parameter, it works fine. But what happens now when I try to give it an array of strings or more than one string, it generates an error because currently it can only handle one string. Now, one problem with this is if I call this function with no computer name, it runs and it doesn't generate an error, which is not how I want it to work. So I'm going to define the computer name parameter as mandatory. That's the only change I've made, is this mandatory designation. Now what you'll commonly see, you'll see equal and you'll see true. If you're running PowerShell version 2, that syntax is required. But if you're running 3 or higher, you don't need true. You just need to say, if you specify it's on, and if you don't specify it's off. It's the same sort of thing if you specified false. There's no reason that I can think of to ever specify false, because if you don't specify this at all, then it's false. So since I'm running version 5, and I'll write my commands for version 3, which is typically what I work with, and there's a require statement you can specify at the very beginning of your function, and I've got some more information later on about that. But you can require a specific version. So if somebody tried to run a command that I wrote for version 3, or say version 4 on version 3, it wouldn't run. Okay, so now when I call this function, then it says, hey, wait a minute, you didn't give me a computer name, give me a computer name, so maybe I'm going to give it DC01. Well, it took one computer name and then it took off with it. So what if I want to specify more than one computer name? Well, I can add these other two square braces, and it'll allow for an array of strings for more than one value. So now if I run this, I could say, notice it's asking for a computer name 0. So I could say DC01, PC01. Now one thing I'll tell you, if you noticed in these functions, and actually I haven't done this yet, but there's instead of localhost or using dot for the local computer name, I'll generally use the environment variable, which is computer name, environment computer name. You can't specify that at this point because it won't translate that variable to a name. It has to be the real name. So notice our output. So if I entered that environment variable, typically you would get the local computer name, and that's another way to make your functions dynamic. But what I'm going to do here is I want to specify a default value, and that's where this computer name environment variable is coming in at. One thing to keep in mind is with mandatory parameters, you cannot use a default value. So now you would think if I called the function, it would use the local computer name, and it doesn't. It still asks for, hey, give me a computer name. And if I don't give it one, it'll give me an error. So if you're going to use a default value, you need to switch over. Instead of defining the parameter as mandatory, you're going to use the validate not null or empty parameter validation attribute. So I'll go ahead and load that function into memory. And now when I call it, notice PC01 is the computer name that if I had code in there would have been the code it would have executed against. Now if you specify values, it doesn't use the default value. So if I specify server name 01 and 02, notice it didn't add that to the default I gave it. It used it instead of the default. And there's many more ways to perform a parameter validation. There's validate range, there's validate set, and I'm going to give you some resources toward the end of this for that, but I want to cover a couple more that are a little less common that you won't see in a lot of the documentation. So I can validate against, say, an enumeration. So there's an enumeration for the console colors in PowerShell. So if I run this, I've actually defined the enumeration as the default value. So those are the colors that are valid. So if I specify blue and dark blue, those are valid, but pink is not valid. So if I run it, it's going to generate an error, and it's going to immediately terminate the function instead of trying to do anything. You can also validate against type accelerators, and in this example, I'm going to use the IP address type accelerator, because you could actually use validate script, and there's another way to do it too, but you could write a lot of code to validate an IP address with a regular expression. And even with the regular expression, you wouldn't have to write that much code, but you're writing more than using a type accelerator like I'm going to use here. So simply by using the IP address type accelerator, which is defined here, I can give it an IP address, and hey, that's a valid IP address, valid IPv4 address. If I give it an invalid, hey, it knows it. I give it a valid IPv6. Yeah.
How do you find all of the type accelerators that people could use? Do you know?
That's one of the things where I have used Bing or Google or whatever your preference is. I have not found an easy way to find all the type accelerators. If someone does know that, hit me up.
Yeah, if somebody wants to put it in one of the questions, I'll tell everybody where to find it.
So if I specify an invalid IPv6 address, it'll tell me it's invalid. So I don't have to write code to validate IPv4s, v6s, and so on. I can do this one thing, and it just works. Okay, verbose output. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's actually very easy. So verbose, you can use verbose output once you've added commandlet binding to turn your function into an advanced function. But what I'm going to show you here to start with is a lot of times you'll find people they'll specify inline comments like I've done here. Well, then even if you use the verbose parameter, then you don't get that output. So inline comments are fine if you're doing something that's really odd and you only want a developer to find it and it's buried in a 500-line script. But the problem, even when you use them in that scenario, a lot of times code will get updated and then people will be lazy and they won't update the documentation that exists with it. So you end up with stale or out-of-date documentation in there. And if you use verbose output, then it's much more likely that it'll be seen, but also if it's not right, since it's more likely to be seen, it's more likely to be corrected. So I can take the same information here, I can specify it with write verbose. And when I run it without the verbose parameter, I don't get the verbose output, but when I specify the verbose parameter, I get the verbose output. So that's the idea, and it can help you with troubleshooting your functions.
Mike, we got a John Bruckler who's saying that if you use the accelerators data type and then use the : to run the get method, so : get, it should show the accelerators for anybody who's looking for more of them.
Okay. So you're actually he's using, sounds like the .NET class to find them is what I'm guessing.
Correct, yep.
Okay, so pipeline input. And pipeline input is something that can be very confusing. I've got a couple of pitfalls I'm going to show you. So the only thing I've done at this point, I'm using a mandatory parameter. I've added this value from pipeline. So when you accept pipeline input, there's 3 blocks you can add. You can add a begin block, you can add a process block, and an end block. The begin block happens before the pipeline input, and I'm going to show you that. The process block occurs once for each item that's accepted as pipeline input. So if you send 100 items through the pipeline, the process block would occur one time for each of those 100 things. And then the end block is really for cleanup. Now, so you would have begin, and this is not required to be in uppercase, but I prefer to do it that way. So you'd have a begin block, and then you would have an end block. May help if I could spell. And I'll see people, they'll write their code like that even though they don't have anything in it. I prefer not to do that because I don't like code in there that doesn't do anything, because to me in my mind it adds unnecessary complexity. But with the computer name parameter that's being accepted via pipeline input, you cannot use that parameter in the begin block, and I will show that in a second. So let's go ahead and get rid of these two. So we're just going to pipe in a couple of computer names, and notice they were outputted. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible because you can really make this over complicated. So I'm going to create a new object, and if I show you what's in the variable, it's actually two computer names. So if I try to pipe that object to our function, then with PowerShell 5, this is a little bit different than what I've seen with version 4. Version 4, you typically just get an error with this. But what I want to show you is what needs to happen. You need to accept value from pipeline by property name. This example here is really accepting it by type. So since DC01 and PC01 are strings, and we're accepting string input on the computer name, it's coming in on that parameter. So now I've removed the value from pipeline and added value from pipeline by property name. So now if I try to send strings through the pipeline, it's going to generate an error. But if I send that object through the pipeline, it works. And because now what's occurring is, although object is a different type, it's a PS custom object, it's binding by property name. So if I want both of those to work, I'm actually going to specify both of them. So I can pipe these strings and it works, and then I can pipe the custom object that has two items that are computer names to the function, and it works fine. And of course, the value from pipeline is what it always tries first, and it only tries by property name if that value from pipeline doesn't work. Okay, so, I know what I was doing here, and actually looks like I'm going to move this comment so people downloading this will not get confused. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you that the computer name is not available in the begin block, and also you can omit even the process block. So notice no output was received from either of these, and it's because the computer name variable is not available. So if I add something to this, if I just add test computer name, so you notice just test was outputted. So it is outputting information. It's that the computer name variable is not available because begin occurs before the pipeline input is accepted. If you have any code, if you decided to do something like write verbose, outside of these blocks, you'll get an error. You should get an error. We'll test that. And we do. Because once you add pipeline input, once you add the begin, the process, and the end, all your code has to exist in one of those blocks. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about error handling. And with error handling, we're specifically going to be talking about try, catch, finally. So we're going to use test WSMAN. We're just going to see if we can connect to computers. And this works fine with DC01, but when I give it a computer name of does not exist, then it's going to generate an unhandled exception for that one computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add this try-catch block to catch the error so it's not an unhandled exception. And when I run this, it's going to generate an unhandled exception. And the reason is that try-catch only handles terminating errors, and this command doesn't generate a terminating error. So the way, if you're using a commandlet, it will have a error action stop, and you should specify that on a per command basis. There's also an error action preference variable that's like a global scope variable, a default variable. Try not to modify that because that modifies it for your entire session. Now there's times if you're working with something in the .NET framework that it's not going to have a error action preference variable for the command itself. And what you could do is change the error action preference variable, the globally scoped one, but then after you run your command, go ahead and change it back. So anyway, let's try our command again. So this time we should not have an unhandled exception. Notice we just generated a warning. We could have just as easily used write error to generate an error message. Now you may also want to generate your own terminating error. So if you want to say if something and then else you want to generate a terminating error, you'll use throw for that. And I've got I think it's just about underscore throw for that help topic. It's not something I'll demonstrate in here, but one more tip with this is catch is not required. So I could catch or finally is required, and finally is something you would generally use with cleanup. So if I change this to finally, finally is always going to be called whether it was successful or not. So we should get that warning on both our machines, and actually we didn't. Let's see. Oh, it's okay. But anyway, catch is not required, but typically when I'm writing my functions, I normally don't use finally because I normally don't have cleanup work to do. I'll use try catch. Okay, comment-based help. This is some help that I wrote for a function called get Mr. Auto Stop Service. And what I did, I just cut the help out of this. So for your functions, now the help I generally put it just inside, and you can see I collapsed it here, but I put it just inside the function declaration. There's like 3 different places it can be specified at. You can specify it before the function declaration. You can even specify afterwards. And there's some rules to that. I think if it's before, there can only be like one blank line before it. I find I like to put it inside the function so I can collapse the function if I put these into a script module. So that way I don't have to collapse the help and the function. And also it helps me to know what help goes with what function. So just like and what comment-based help does, it makes help work just like all the other commandlets. So if a user is not familiar with your function, they can run help, the name of the function, and any of the parameters that you would normally run. So you can see my examples that I had defined in this, and so on. Now the syntax for this is not something that you're going to remember, at least not me. So what I'll typically do, I'll just open up another session. I'll say Control-J for snippets. I'll go to the complete function. And this gives me a lot of the different syntax that if I can't remember it, if it's something I don't use all the time, like validate set, their syntax is not exactly the way I would do it. I would use single quotes there. But you can go grab the comment-based help out of this and copy and paste it as a template. Now, one thing I'll say is you'll notice synopsis is not in uppercase like all the other keywords here, so I would change that. And they've specified it outside the function declaration. They also put their curly braces on the next line, and that's fine. It depends on what style of writing code that you prefer. One thing I would say is pick a standard and stick with it. Okay, I've got some additional resources here. So there's the require statement, and I'll actually show you that in another function I have here. So just before the function declaration, you can say requires version 3.0. You can say that it requires specific modules and so on. Typically, that's what I'll use it for, is the version or the modules. Now, when you move it into, if you move your functions into a script module, and that I do recommend that, and you could dot source the external functions with the script module or have them in the script module itself. But you should always create a module manifest, and you can control the version and the required module, other modules with the manifest as well. Okay, I've got some other resources here. So other help topics, that stuff I didn't cover. There's a community book of PowerShell best practices that I recommend that's hosted by PowerShell.org. There's also a PowerShell practice and style guide that's on GitHub that I recommend also. I've got a walkthrough blog on how I write PowerShell functions. And I think we've got a couple more things here I did want to cover. So support should process. It has nothing to do really with pipeline input. When you should use support should process is anytime your functions are making changes. And specifically, if you ask yourself the question, is this a resume generating event, then you should add support should process, because what support should process does is adds what if and confirm support. Now, if the commandlets that you're using inside your function already support what if and confirm, then there's not a lot of additional work you need to do other than adding that declaration. And let me show you how it's added. It's added here in commandlet binding. But if the commands inside your function don't support what if and confirm, then you've got additional work to do, like if you're using the .NET framework or something. Now, one thing I'll show you here is really neat, that I've actually wrapped invoke command inside this function, and I'm using splatting, and I provided that help topic as well. But you can actually use splatting in a remote session. So you're probably familiar with the using variable scope modifier. So, and you would use $ using for the variable and then colon the variable name, but you can say @using and use that splatting remotely. I wrote a Hey Scripting Guy blog article a while back, and it has this function, and I will provide this code as well. But with services on a machine, and I want to show you this, we're going to use the GUI. I say we will. I may have it open. And maybe we won't use the GUI. Anyway, if you're familiar with services, there are services in Windows that have a delayed auto start, and this is a screenshot from Windows 10. Windows 10, and this is not a PowerShell thing, but Windows 10 actually adds delayed auto start property to the to WMI, to the Win32 service class. And this does not exist on prior operating systems, even if you have PowerShell version 5. So if you're querying a machine and you want to get the services that are set to run automatically but are not running, but you want to exclude the delayed auto start because those shouldn't necessarily be running anyway. You have to go to the registry of that machine. So the way I'd previously written a command is just I wrapped a function around invoke command. I don't typically like doing that because then you're making the assumption, and you can test for PowerShell remoting being enabled. But with Windows 10, they actually add this so you can run a query, a simple query to grab the services that should be running that are not. And actually, I see a couple here that says they're running. So actually, I see what I did wrong on that. Anyway, what I'm getting at with that is I took all these things I've talked about, and I actually wrote a function, and it uses pipeline input, and I have a credential parameter, and I have a begin block, and so on. But what it does is this one, and you'll notice I'm actually querying the registry through WMI, because I wanted to be able to run this command on a machine that doesn't have PowerShell on it, a remote machine, through WMI. But I also wanted to be able to take advantage of WSMan when a machine on newer machines. So it actually builds sim sessions with either WSMan or DCOM, and it will query those machines. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and load this into memory. And as you saw earlier, SQL 03 didn't have PowerShell installed on it. So now we'll run this command. We'll find out what services are not running on these machines that should be running that are not set to delayed auto start. And you'll notice we even got a record return from SQL 03 that doesn't have PowerShell installed. So maybe I want to start those services. Now my start command, I haven't rewritten it. It does use invoke command. So I've added the support should process to this. So I can use what if and confirm. So I can say what if, and it says it would have started those services on the domain controller. I can also use confirm, so I can run this, and then I can say no, and I could say yes or no, but I'll just say no to that. And by default, I have this set where it doesn't output any, it doesn't give you any output, but I'm using a pass-through parameter, so I could specify that, and it actually becomes part of this, part of the hash table that I'm using for splatting, and it uses a switch statement for that. Okay, let's see if we have anything else to cover. I want to jump back to my PowerPoint at this point, and I can come back if we have any questions. Okay, that's not exactly where we were, but hey, we'll deal with it. Okay, so some additional resources to find more information. There's a free ebook on PowerShell Advanced Functions that was a collection of blog articles that me, along with 5 other PowerShell MVPs, actually contributed to. It's for PS Blog Week. And this is linked, but you can find that on my blog. It was me and Jeff Hicks and Gene Blender, Francois Xavier, Bo Prox, and Adam Bertrand. So that's a very good free ebook. Then blogs is another great resource. If you do go out to my blog, I have a blog roll that's got a lot of my preferred resources for PowerShell code and information. User groups, there are a lot of different PowerShell user groups. As I previously said, I run the Mississippi PowerShell user group, and we meet on the second Tuesday of every month. We're meeting next Tuesday, and it's at 8:30 p.m. Central Time. We've got Bo Prox next week talking about run spaces. PowerShell.org, of course, is who's hosting this webinar. They have a great website that's got a lot of resources. They host the PowerShell Summit, the scripting games. and they have really good forums. So if you have specific questions, feel free to ask them here. But if you come up with something later, ask it on PowerShell.org. You'll get an answer. You'll get 10 answers, and that way you'll get different aspects of from different people. PowerShell Magazine, they have a great site also. The Hey Scripting Guy blog is a great resource for all things PowerShell. The Microsoft Virtual Academy, they have some really good videos. It doesn't matter what technology, what Microsoft technology, but specifically the PowerShell and the desired state configuration videos are really good. And the only paid resource on this slide is Pluralsight, and I certainly don't represent Pluralsight, but they do have some great videos. And then this is where you can find me. My blog is micahfrobbins.com. I have an alias for that, kind of like I do with my commandlets and modules, mrpowershell.com. Find me on Twitter. I'm a big believer in personal branding, so I'm pretty much Micah Frobbins everywhere. If you want my email, go out to my About page. I have a security-related riddle that you can solve in PowerShell and get my email address. And then, of course, my user group, and we have an alias for it that's easier to remember than the real URL, but it's mspowershell.com. Okay, do we have any questions?
No, actually, you seem to answer a lot of them as you were going. So I think we're good.
Okay, like I said, I was just going to say, I tried to keep this session, where it wasn't overcomplicated. I want to give you an overview of the process and then give you some additional resources, because I know that this is a lot to take in as it is without making it too complicated.
All right, and where are you going to share out that script?
As soon as the video is made available, what I'll do, I'll publish a blog article. It'll be on my blog. I'll embed the video from your guys' page in a blog article, and then I'll put a link to a zip file where you can download the 3 scripts that I demonstrated, and also a PDF copy of the slide deck.
All right, yeah, because people are asking a lot of questions about where they can find this stuff. But yeah, Mike, thank you very much for volunteering. This was great.
Thank you. You guys enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. And for everybody else, the next